Hello, and welcome to this chat with Deb about podcasts. Have you heard of podcasts before? Is it something you're familiar with? Podcasts are becoming much more popular these days, and so today's chat with Deb is going to share with you some of my favorite podcasts that I listen to when I'm commuting to and from work. The first podcast I want to share with you is called Stuff You Should Know. It's hosted by Josh and Chuck. On my presentation, which I will share with you, there's a link to their website as well as a link to the iTunes link. You can use the podcast app on your phone and simply subscribe to the podcast. But this is Stuff You Should Know, and it is so interesting. I just listened to this one this morning, how bonsai works. It's something that I didn't know a lot about, and now I know so much more about this, and I find it so interesting. Now, Josh and Chuck sometimes can go off on tangents a bit, but if you don't mind them talking about just random things, I find this podcast so interesting. Some of these are really unique, interesting topics. After I get done listening to this podcast, I often find that I feel a lot more smart about things that I'm not sure matter in the end, but it doesn't matter because I just feel more intelligent having listened to Stuff You Should Know. Another podcast that educators might really find interesting is by Vicki Davis. It's called Every Classroom Matters. And if we look at the website link for this one, what you will notice is Vicki Davis does podcasts where she interviews different educators from all over the place. So she does one a week, and if you go through here, you can listen to any of these. Perhaps you know some of these folks. The topics are always very interesting, so I love listening to this one each week, and I think you'll find it interesting. This next podcast is another great one for educators. This is the Bedley brothers, Scott and Tim, and if we go to their website, what you're going to see is that they produce podcasts also highlighting different educators from all over. And what I really like here is that what they share is very informative, but it's also very much connected to what's happening today in education. And so I find these really, really super current, and the topics that are shared are really great. So check that one out. All right, one of my absolute favorite podcasts, if I had to pick just one podcast to listen to for the rest of my life, it is Radiolab. I don't know if you've ever heard of this podcast before. What I love about it is, first of all, they use the most interesting music and sound effects throughout the entire podcast, so it's very pleasing to listen to. But the other thing I love about this site is the topics that they cover are so interesting and so engaging that you almost just can't help but to keep listening the whole time. A lot of the topics on Radiolab are science-based. I have shared quite a few of the podcasts that I've listened to in Radiolab with our chemistry teachers and our physics teachers because of the topics that they cover. If I had to pick one podcast to start with that would get you hooked on listening to podcasts, it would be Radiolab. And for me, it all got started with the Serial podcast. The whole idea here is that they take a crime that's been committed and they analyze it and look at the person or people involved and kind of go through that entire crime. As is true with most podcasts, the host of the podcast often makes the podcast more interesting to listen to. And the host of this one is Sarah Koenig, and she just does such an amazing job. I highly recommend listening to season 1 for sure of Serial. Podcasts are great. So why do I listen to podcasts? Well, first of all, it really gives me something to talk about with my colleagues, especially those folks who are listening to the same podcast that I am. A bunch of us listen to the Serial podcast. We love to sit and Voxer on a Friday morning after the Thursday episode and just talk about our thoughts. Oh my gosh, some of our conversations get so interesting. You know, and it does increase your knowledge. Podcasts are great for that, right? I love that when I'm doing something like recently I've been doing a lot of painting at my house. I can just sit and listen to a podcast while I'm painting. I can have that access anytime that I want to. One day I was stopped at a train. I thought the train would never end. I just turned on a podcast and the time just started to fly by. And of course, my number one reason for podcasts is they're just pure entertainment. It is my form of TV because I do not watch much TV, but I absolutely love listening to podcasts on my phone. I hope you consider giving podcasts a try.